Hi, this is Will Cowing for Adaptive Chicago Productions, and I want to welcome you to our show. We have a really good guest today, Estvan. Have I got your name right? Good, good. Now, what exactly do you do here at Access Living?
So I'm the Education Policy Director for Access Living, and I've been doing this with some breaks in service here at the agency for 20 years.
Okay, now that involves lobbying, doesn't it?
It involves lobbying in Springfield. It involves analytical work on the Chicago public school system, on the state, and work with individual families of students with disabilities, and some dispute resolution issues with the school districts.
Now, you say analytical work. What do you mean by that?
So I examine every year for the last, I think about 12 years running, the Chicago Public Schools budget and policies regarding students with disabilities. And we're the only organization that does that kind of work in Chicago, and nationally it is not done very frequently at all.
So you look at the budget, you see what proportion of the budget is spent on students with disabilities.
Yes.
Now, has that been going up or going down, or what do you say?
The numbers historically have risen because of the facts of, generally speaking, there's about a 2% inflation factor just underlying, and then there's been periodic raises given to teachers that drive up the cost factor. The number of students with disabilities are somewhat variable, but unlike the overall enrollment of Chicago public schools, they have actually gone up over the last few years. So there's been more students identified with disabilities in the last few years, even though the enrollment of the whole district has declined.
Now, is there a distinction made between students for special education and students with disabilities, or are they blended together now?
There's two types of students with disabilities. There's those that are identified pursuant to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and they have IEPs. And then there are students with disabilities who are identified pursuant to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And the Section 504 students are generally, could be a student that just has, for instance, a mobility-related disability and needs accommodation for things like bathroom and other types of things, or has an other accommodation need that doesn't require an actual special education teacher for the student on a regular basis. So there's two groupings. The 504 students are much smaller than the IEP students.
Now, you say IED?
IEP.
IEP. Now, what does that stand for?
Individualized Education Plan.
Individual. Now, who makes up the individual?
There's a core team at every school, in every public school in the United States, that will help that drafts the IEP along with the parent or guardian of the child.
All right, now, this is done on each child?
On each child in the United States.
Parents sit down with the teacher?
With a team, with a full team.
And they come up with a plan?
Right.
Oh, okay, okay. Now, what is the first observation you'd like to make about how the budget and the fiscal changes have been affecting people with disabilities in the last year or two?
Well, as it relates to Chicago public school students with disabilities, as we know, the Chicago Public Schools has walked the borderline of bankruptcy. They have had to borrow a lot of money over the last few years to stay solvent. A budget deal was worked out in the last couple months, and this is now July of 2016 that I'm talking, to try to keep CPS functional. And CPS got money for its pension obligations for its teachers and staff from the state. It got some other money that is based on taxation of property owners in the city. So there was a certain level of stability brought to the district that it didn't have a year before that. But in the whole picture of things, Chicago Public Schools are probably going to be running a $240 to $300 million deficit, which is better than a $500 million deficit.
Now, that's for the entire public school system.
That's for Chicago Public School
Chicago
System.
Public School. How does that break down for students with disabilities?
Well, it's very complex because the budget has not been formally produced, but the schools have gotten their individual budgets from the administration. And generally what we're seeing is that at the middle of last year, there were about $120 million of budget cuts that applied to schools overall, and a number of cuts that applied to special education only. And some of those special education only budget cuts were restored by Mr. Claypool, but they were restored late in last year. So late in November of 2015, and they restored about $42 million in positions. However, that late in the year, the schools could not hire teachers. So there were no more special education teachers to be hired at that point. There simply is a shortage of qualified special education teachers in the state of Illinois and nationally, and there were very few to be hired. So those positions sat empty for the majority of the school year, and now this year, CPS has decided to base its budgeting system on the prior year because they had a more complex formula that was very problematic. And so the numbers they're taking from the prior year are the post-cut numbers, and they're only taking the amount that they expended for special ed. So that means if they weren't able to hire a teacher, they don't get funded for the unfunded position. And if they hired the teacher, let's say in January of 2016, they will only get the money that they paid out to that teacher from January of 2016 to June, the end of June. So their budget overall has all kinds of different shortfalls depending on the ability of the school to get money. So like LaSalle Magnet School on the north side probably has about $170,000 shortfall for special education because of these things. It got many positions restored but was not able to hire and needs those positions to serve as students, but the money is not there. CPS is going to open some kind of appeal process, but that's also very complex. And the pool of money for the appeals is actually being taken out of school budgets to be held in a reserve fund for appeals. So the basic strategy of CPS is trying to maintain as limited a growth as possible in special education spending for this current fiscal year, which will be FY17.
So when you say that there's growth, what can you give us how this breaks down for an individual student? Special ed student. Does this mean that there'd be less time being spent in the classroom? Maybe.
Well, CPS would indicate publicly that their position is that every minute of IEP services delineated in those IEPs will be provided to each and every student in Chicago Public Schools. If you talk to the Chicago Teachers Union and individual special education teachers, they dispute that. If you talk to some of the principals that are willing to talk, and we should remember 65 principals have left CPS that are not retiring, they just transferred out, some of them in anticipation of fiscal problems for the school district in the coming year. If you talk to some of them, they say they were not able to service all the IEPs. So there's a dispute there between what the district claims and what we hear from teachers. We hear from parents quite frequently that their children did not receive all the services delineated on their IEPs.
And what would be examples of services?
So every IEP actually indicates the minutes that a teacher is supposed to be, a special education teacher is supposed to be servicing that child, whether in a regular education classroom or outside that classroom. And parents are being told anecdotally by their children, like saying, "Did you go see Mrs. So-and-so today?" no, Mrs. So-and-so was too busy to see me, so we didn't have that session today. So it's very anecdotal, and it's very difficult to prove in a legal setting. The documentation on this, on actual delivery of minutes, is a issue that is in dispute right now. The Service Employees International Union is actually in a dispute with Chicago Public Schools over these records and has appealed to the Attorney General's office to have CPS be more forthcoming with these service delivery records.
So what's happening is a student may just be sitting in the classroom and nothing going on.
It could happen very well that they will not be given special ed services and will be with the regular ed teacher who cannot deliver those services when they're supposed to be getting services. But the level and the amount that is happening within the district is not easily determinable.
I have a principal that retired, lives next door to me, and she was telling me this exactly same thing, that the special ed kids were getting shortchanged. Now, you go down to Springfield, right?
Yes.
Is there any hope in Springfield?
Here's the problem. It's like walking on glass in Springfield on this issue. If I start raising issues about noncompliance for Chicago Public Schools, it feeds into, and I'll be very honest here, the Republican narrative that they're all crooks down in Chicago, and that we're giving them money, and it's going like old. I don't know if you remember this guy. His name was Pate Phillips.
Oh, yeah.
So old Pate Phillips, who was from the Republican Party in the old days,
Right.
used to call giving money to Chicago Public Schools sending it down the rat hole.
Yeah.
So frankly, the Republicans in Springfield are more than willing to listen to your complaints about CPS not providing services, because it builds up their narrative that everybody's crooks here. But it's actually much more complex on the trap that the district's in, because the district has to formally say, we're compliant, and reality-wise cannot deliver everything that they need to deliver for the kids. So it's sort of like a catch-22, with everybody trapped in a circle of deception, let us say.
Yeah.
You know?
So are there any bills right now that might help this situation that they're working on?
Well, I mean, the biggest problem on this is not the bills that are in and have been passed. It's revenue for the state. And it goes to issues like the fact that we have a flat income tax, and that we actually lowered the rate of that flat income tax several years ago and never raised it back up. And that we have a governor that will veto almost every tax increase that's proposed. And so we have a very unprogressive revenue system in Illinois. So if we raise taxes on the flat income tax, then what happens is that the poorest person who's taxable is going to be taxed at the same rate as the richest person. And so every time we raise that percentage, effectively what happens is it hurts lower income people that are taxed. And so it's a very difficult to get a tax bill through given the flat tax that exists in the Illinois Constitution.
We have a submitted question here. The CILA facilities send their residents to the so-called schools. Has the budget affected these people?
So there are very few SILA residents in the city proper that have that are children, but there are a wide variety of wards of the state that a whole spectrum of people, like DCFS children that have disabilities and other such children that are in group settings or other things like that that go to CPS. And yes, it affects them, in particular over the social work and psychological services. And the best example of that complexity is the murdered CPS student, Laquan McDonald. You know who we're talking about, right?
Okay, now can you fill the audience in who missed
So
out?
Laquan McDonald was a young man, a young adult, African-American adult, who was having a bad drug experience, who was walking down a street with a knife in his hand and was non-compliant to orders from police officers to drop the knife, and was shot at a distance of maybe 20 or 30 feet by an officer who is now being charged with manslaughter. 16 times.
16.
So Laquan McDonald is the poster child of these children, because Laquan McDonald went from a variety of different settings, from prison settings to what you would call alternative school settings, living with different relatives in and out as a DCFS ward. And the services that were given to that student to deal with all of his anxieties and stress factors and all that were minimal. And that is really based on the research of a reporter who's now at WBEZ Radio named Sarah Karp. And she did an extensive analysis of Laquan's life. And so what we're seeing is there are many Laquan McDonalds. And so when we're talking about things like murder in the city of Chicago by young black men, some of those young black men are emotionally disturbed and need serious support within this society. Those resources are not there. They just are not available. And CPS knows this, and the state knows this, and they have done nothing. And the truth be, the city of Chicago and the Chicago Public Schools did their very best to attempt to not expose the reality of somebody like Laquan McDonald, to make it publicly known. It was dealt with very abstractly. It was very difficult to even find out that he was a CPS student. They used records protection rules to block virtually all research. And really, Sarah's work in this was based on the goodwill of teachers that knew this child and specialists that knew this child, who were willing to actually provide this material to her even after his death, because they thought it was important that the public know the real story of Laquan McDonald and his death.
Well, Sheriff Dart, didn't he say that the largest mental health facility is the Cook County Jail?
And the Cook County Jail is actually a lower percentage of mental health problems than the Cook County Juvenile Detention Facility.
Oh.
The Cook County Juvenile Detention Facility has actually got a higher percentage of its inmates or residents that have mental health problems. It's probably 70%. Whereas in the formal Cook County jail setting, we're talking between 30 and 45%.
Ooh.
So it is much higher. And the reason for that is that there's a great reluctance on the juvenile courts to actually put a child in a detention facility. And so it is really the young people that are most repetitive that end up in that facility. And in many respects, those are also young people that have mental health problems and other special education issues. So it is a very big issue.
And this is not just confined to the Chicago area. I mean, there was a case down in Miami recently.
It happens all over America, and it can be a wide variety of disabling conditions, including things like schizophrenia. And early onset child schizophrenia is not well understood in the field, and many young people who are becoming schizophrenic, it happens in adolescence. And if their meds work, there's no consistency for them taking those meds. And sometimes there's resistance on their part because the medication that might modify a schizophrenic issue also doesn't make you feel very good. So, it's very complex situation. So.
Yeah, that's okay. We have another question here. And I wanted to mention Scylla. Now, for people that don't know what a Scylla is, could you give us?
Yes, a SILA is a living facility that is kind of a cooperative one where people with disabilities live in more of a smaller setting that is you often standalone. So it's kind of it would have a small number of people with a support system for those people in that setting.
And usually, aren't these a better facility for people than some of the
Than a large institution.
Large institution.
Yes, and it's much more the norm around America now than large facilities are.
Okay. Now I want to talk about for a second about activity aides. Now these are people that are not actual teachers, but they help with the teacher. They help the teachers. Are they included in this category of how the money is spent?
Yes. So there's two types of aides in the Chicago Public Schools. There's an instructional aide and there's a non-instructional aide, and they're actually in two different unions. The non-instructional aides might be like a bus attendant or a what we used to call child welfare attendant, and they're more like a personal assistant, and they might help with things like bathroom changing for severely disabled students who can't bathroom
Incontinent, yeah.
Right, and feeding. They might be involved in feeding. Instructional aides sometimes do that work too, but their focus and their education requirements are higher, so they're required to have a junior college education. And the instructional aides are generally in the Chicago Teachers Unions, and the other aides are generally in the Service Employees International Union. So yes, it affects them, and there's a big dispute over aides. One of the disputes is the level of dependency of students on aides. So like how much support do you want an individual student with a significant disability to get from that aide? And then how do you fade those supports? And there's always disputes over this issue. Like, when do you fade the supports? Do you fade the supports? Or is Chicago Public Schools just trying to cut an aide position?
Now, when you say when do you fade the support, what exactly do you mean?
So what we're talking about is a student who has a significant disability that has self-injurious behaviors. And you literally have an aide for a couple of students like that that's going to intervene with that student to prevent them from hitting their head on the table even with the helmet. Or and will be involved in a behavior modification process for that student, or a student with a severe intellectual disability who may need hand-over-hand work in tasks that would seem relatively simple to most people in the audience, but like placing blocks in a tray. Now, at what point is that student independent and you stop doing the hand-over-hand? That's a judgment call. Because if you keep doing hand over hand, does that person ever become independent of that skill? Now that's an area of dispute constantly in special education. And it goes all the way up into more complex issues, because you would have students with aids that will be in a high school geometry class that are working one-on-one with the student to organize them. For instance, a kid with severe ADHD that can't focus on their note-taking. So at what point do you begin to back off on that aid so that student becomes more independent? And the thrust of that back off is really based on the big transition for students with disabilities from the K through 12 education system to post-secondary. Because once you enter post-secondary, you're not given all these entitlements. You fall under the American with Disabilities Act. And under ADA, what you get is accommodations, not these level of services that you get on K through 12.
I understand now. What about the work-study programs for special ed? Are those pretty much going by the by?
No, they do exist, and Access Living here is working on a program with CPS. Their funding is severely restricted, and the other complexity in these programs is that they are also co-funded by federal and state funds, and those federal and state funds flow through the Illinois Department of Human Services Division of Rehab Services. And the rules regarding those services are quite interesting, because really the focus is on competitive work and competitive work standards. And so the standards that are expected of the young people with disabilities are pretty high in those programs. And it is a very difficult to get sufficient support. So some young people who work at, let's say, a Jewel Foods, doing kind of bagging issues, need to advance from bagging to a more complex work skill.
Like stocking the shelves?
To like stocking the shelves, or even maybe becoming a butcher, right? To make that step forward requires additional support services that Jewel, of course, isn't going to pay for, right? Because that would be sucking its profits away. The Department of Human Services, DRS agency that provides those job coaching supports, and even the school district that might do it for a while, those services end once that student's a successful bagger, okay? They don't go up that continuum. So we don't in America have a system that really takes people with significant disabilities by the hand and advances them. And the same thing applies to the construction trades. You can get a person sometimes in a very remedial job in construction trades, for instance, doing cleanup. But to get them the skill to become a carpenter or a pipe fitter or anything like that, which would require a huge amount of work on the part of a coach, that doesn't exist. And so we have a trap for people with disabilities that even make employment on their advancement. It's sort of expected, like by magic, some of these people with significant disabilities are suddenly going to be able to advance and get all these skills necessary with accommodations in the workplace without specialized job coaching. Because believe me, it ends at that entry level.
That's what I thought.
Unless it's a wonderful company that provides these kind of things. And those are rare and far between.
Well, we're coming to an end now, so I just want to know if there, what is the last thing you'd like to talk about, for just to give you, like, say, a minute to finish up on?
I would just say that if there are parents that end up watching this show and they have questions like that they should reach out to Access Living. And we are more than happy to take their phone calls and talk to them about the individual problems facing their children. That they're not alone in the problems that they're having. There are many parents that have problems with the Chicago Public Schools and schools beyond Chicago. And that, you know, we're here and other agencies are here to do the best we can to try to give them advice and support. So that's what I would like to end by saying.
Okay, well, we thank you very much,
All right.
and deeply appreciate your
All right.
work here.
Okay.